So let's get going. But first of all, welcome and thank you for joining this morning. We really appreciate you taking the time to join us this morning. What I'm going to be talking about is the development of professional skills around taxation and your ability to answer your questions as if you are sitting in front of a client and answering the client's questions. And that is really what the professional skill is about. Using your knowledge to get to a perfect answer, a structured answer, an answer that gives you maximum marks. So let's get into the detail. First of all, we've got a tax act, and that is your primary source, your resource of knowledge, and it is generally flagged. In some instances, I got emails asking students, I've overflagged and I'm lost and I don't know why I flagged certain items. Well, that makes the resource less usable. You must always understand, why do you flag something? In fact, you must go wider than that. You must ask yourself, why do you flag an act? Why do we have the act or that section in the act? Why do we have that section in the act? For some students, tax is the monster in the corner, but all you need to get is a bit of passion for the subject. A passion leads to success, but how can you develop this passion? And you can develop this passion by asking yourself, why do we have a section in the act? And every single section in the act is there for a reason. It's not there for any other reason other than dealing with a specific issue, and it's got a specific reason. I took, for example, just something that I could think of just out of the top of my head. I thought about transfer pricing. Why do we have transfer pricing in the act? Have you ever thought about this, or do you simply study transfer pricing? Studying transfer pricing, I think, is really not the correct thing to do. I think it's much easier to understand transfer pricing and why do we have transfer pricing in the act. And if you understand the why, you create the passion. Once you've got the passion, you know how to structure your solutions to questions. You know how to structure your presentation to the client. Why do we have transfer pricing? Well, it's simple. A South African company sells its stock to an overseas subsidiary at a reduced price. So it's reducing the income in South Africa and it's increasing the income in the foreign country in order to escape paying tax in South Africa. And that is why we've got transfer pricing. And then transfer pricing goes further. It says, no, you are deemed to have sold at a market-related price under certain circumstances. So it corrects the price that you asked to a market-related price. So it eliminates the profits that you're trying to shift. And then in addition to this, there's something else. And this is what you should also understand, is it says that adjustment is a deemed dividend. Now, you should think to yourself, why is it a deemed dividend? Well, it's simply because you are shifting your income reserves. Your income reserves are being shifted to a foreign company. Not only profits, but your reserves, which is distributable as a dividend, is being shifted. So therefore, it should be subject to a dividend tax as well. And that really is a typical example of why do we need a section in the Act? Develop the passion for the subject. If you've got a scenario or a case study or a client asking you a question, do you jump straight into the detail? Yes or no, this is the answer, and give no reasons. Or even worse, go with a gut feeling in tax. In tax, there is no gut feeling. There's always a right and a wrong. In the Income Tax Act, this is what the Act says. Whatever your gut says is irrelevant. Whatever your logic says is irrelevant. It's what the Act says, but the Act is, in most instances, very logic. So look at the overall picture. Don't jump straight into the detail. The overall picture, zoom out, and in tax, we can generally say that there are two different sections that could be applicable to any transaction. A transaction could either be income, or a transaction could either be a deduction item. And working from there on, income, gross income, that's your starting point. Deduction, general deduction, that's your starting point. So that is really important to zoom out. Look at the overall picture first. If one uses the example of a cat, drawing a cat or drawing a house, the issue is that you need to draw the outlines first before the details. So you are zooming out, you're looking at the bigger picture, and then you zoom in to the detail. While zooming out, you're going to ask yourself, what am I dealing with? Am I dealing with an income item, gross income? Am I dealing with a deduction, a general deduction formula, or maybe a specific deduction formula? But we are dealing with either one of those two. Let's look at an example, a typical example. Let's assume you are confronted with the travel allowance question. Discuss the tax implications of a travel allowance. And it's for 15 marks. So you've got to generate marks with a structure. You can't only just give theory. The application and the structure is going to be the items that get you to the maximum marks. There are only two wide starting points first for the travel allowance as well. Travel allowance is either income or it's a deduction. Well, it's income if we're looking at the individual who receives the travel allowance, or it is a deduction for the company who pays the travel allowance. And then we move into the smaller detail. For example, travel allowance, Section 8 comprehensively deals with how we deal with travel allowance, but then also when we look at the index of the Act, we see that there's a fourth schedule in the Act that deals with PAYE and a definition of remuneration. This is something that you pick up in the index of the Act, and the travel allowance is also remuneration, therefore it's subject to PAYE. Can you see we zoom out and then we zoom into the specific sections. Go to the index pages of the Act. This gives you structure. As I've just explained to you in the travel allowance example, the index pages will give you that structure: gross income first, then the fourth, remuneration definition, then Section 8. That's really a great example how to do that. In other words, learn how to navigate your books. The index. Spend more time in the Tax Act looking at the index instead of flagging the Act, so that you understand the index and know how to use the index in the exam. That's more important than putting flags all over the show and you're not really sure what the flags were for in the first place. Also, something else. Remember the definitions. That's a very important starting point. Don't just jump into something and start discussing items. Look at whether there are definitions. Of course, if the mark is the marks of the question is such that you've got to zoom out and look at the definitions, then you're going to have to do that. Let's look at another example. A client donated widgets, which is a stock item. We start with the definition of stock. There is a definition of stock, trading stock. So we're going to ask ourselves, is this stock? If the question is, for example, for 15 marks, is it stock? But then we need more marks. We're going to apply that to the scenario. We're going to say thus. We're going to use the word thus, or we're going to use the name of the taxpayer to make it applicable to the taxpayer. But there's also the word Donated. Donation is also defined in the Act. So we've got to look at whether it's donated. And then stock is dealt with specifically in Section 22. This is what you'll pick up in the index. So you can use your index as a very helpful tool to get to a professional structure in your solution. The index, therefore, leads to a breakdown of the topics, and that would limit your flags. If you've got flags that are very useful and optimal, that would really enhance your time spent in the exam looking at your flags. If you've got flags all over the show, then of course you may waste a lot of time working through the acts and the flags. I want to talk about memory versus thinking. I always started my lectures in tax, and I still do that. If you had a look at my lectures online, I always started with, why do we need this section in the Act? Because you've got to think about this. If you think about it, then it means that you will start to understand it. And once you start understanding it, tax becomes easier, and you will create that passion for tax. And remember, passion leads to success. So it's very important to rather think about tax and work on the structure, the skill of developing a structure, as opposed to memorizing items. But the skill of developing a structure is something that doesn't come quickly, just like that. It's something that you really have to work at. So our suggestion is, as you are building on your theory, as you are going through the revision of your theory, together with that, work on the skill of developing a structure, of developing your professional skills. In other words, do questions. Don't only revise the theory and then at the end work on developing the professional skill. That's not the way to go. Do it in parallel, together. Then at the bottom, my third bullet, tax. Don't go to the section first. Look at the bigger picture. Exercise this on a few questions. If you exercise this on a few questions, and if you exercise this as you proceed through your revision, you will find that at a later stage, you'll become more comfortable with a structure. And that would certainly be the way to go and to get those professional marks and the professional answer to your client. Look at the question and know the answer. That sometimes happens, that you get a scenario and immediately you know what the answer is. And you then simply want to write down the answer. No, don't do that. Rather plan your answer. Start with a wide angle again. Zoom out. Start with the income. Start with the deduction. And then zoom in to the specific item. Don't simply write the answer and then assume that you're going to get 15 marks for that. You've got to ask yourself, did you write 15 items that are relevant to the solution, to the scenario? Did you make it applicable? If you've got the act and the answer, the question is, did you make it applicable to the scenario, to the case study? And if you didn't, then you've got a problem. And how do you make it applicable? I'll repeat this a bit later on, but if you force yourself to use the word thus, for example, you've got a definition and you now need to use the word thus. Thus, the client has stock in his stores. Thus, the name of the taxpayer has stock in his stores. You make it applicable to the scenario. What I just want to mention is that Yvonne's got an article on a website where she looks at why SAICA or why students fails, and SAICA publishes these reasons, and Yvonne wrote an article based on those reasons. So it's very valuable for you to look at that and also pick up some very valuable points from that conversation. So please go to that source as well. What is really important in any professional presentation? In any professional presentation, communication is critical. Communication is how you present your solution. Did you zoom out? Did you tell your client why are you starting at a specific point? Why are you moving into other points? Did you tell your client why you use case law? In other words, you've got to assume that you are talking to a person who doesn't know tax at all. Because if you tell your client something and you throw in the name PE electric tramways, for example, he's going to ask you, but what does PE electric tramways have to do with my scenario or my problem? Well, this is communication. You've got to tell him that we've got case law, and the reason why we've got case law is because there's something fuzzy, there's something in the act that is not clear, and case law clarifies that issue. That's communication. And then, of course, the physical presentation, your introduction paragraph, your use of bullets in your presentation, the underlining of key words to make it easier for the examiner to get the critical core issues, etc. So that is really exam technique as well. Integration is also very important to get to a professional answer. Integration of the issues in the case study, integration of the various sections of the Act, for example, gross income in Section 8, integrated with your definition of remuneration. Your application is another very important point. And this is where I'm stating what I've already stated to you. Application is really so critical. If you write theory, like you see at the bottom of the Act, I say the client has access to Google. He can Google the Tax Act and look at the Act himself. So there's no use in writing the Act in full and leave that as your completed answer. You've got to make it applicable, the application, and you create that possibility. You create the discipline of making it applicable by using the word thus or the name of the taxpayer. The relevance, always talk about the relevance of a specific item. Why is it relevant that you mention the definition of remuneration? Because remuneration incorporates PAYE, and because it incorporates, remuneration incorporates a travel allowance. Remuneration incorporates a travel allowance, and because it includes a travel allowance, it's subject to PAYE. And then we go further with the rules, 80%, 20%, etc., as far as a travel allowance is concerned. Always remember the client has a problem, a starting point, a core issue. Build your answer around that core issue. Yvonne also uses the example of a spider web. Now you can clearly see the spider web that I've created now when I talk to you, discuss a travel allowance. The travel allowance is the core issue, but we are going to start somewhere else. We're going to start at gross income. Gross income is the total amount received or accrued. And the taxpayer received an amount. And then we're going to go to remuneration. That is something else, somewhere else in the spider web. We're dealing with remuneration, and we explain the relevance why we're dealing with remuneration. And then we're going to deal with Section 8. So it's a whole spider web of items that surrounds this core issue that you need to deal with and that you need to present very professionally to your client. As a practical point, I often look at the ITC papers, and to be honest with you, they are really intimidating. You know, they use real life examples that we've never dealt with. For example, cryptocurrency, or cell phone mask producers, etc. And that might be very intimidating. But forget about how this is presented to you. There is always basic marks in every single scenario. In every single scenario, don't get intimidated. Don't go for the high level stuff first. You will find that if you exercise and you go back and look at the solution and you've dealt with the basic marks first, then you will still earn a lot of marks. I'm going to tell you just briefly what happened to me when I wrote the board exam some years ago. For some or other stupid reason, I looked at the previous year's audit paper, and I saw that they asked the audit report, and it was a comprehensive audit report. So while studying, I decided not to spend much time on an audit report because they asked it last year. So effectively, I spotted and I said to myself, the probability of them asking an audit report this year again is very low, and therefore I'm not going to study it in detail. And guess what? The audit report came along, and when I saw that, it really bowled me over. I really went into a panic state, and I knew that I've got a big problem because it was a comprehensive, qualified audit report that you need to write. So what I did is I read through the detail, and I left that question, and I continued with the balance of the questions. But I left myself enough time to go back to the audit report. So at the end of the paper, I went back to the audit report and I wrote the basic marks, the introduction, the conclusion, the dates, etc., etc. But I didn't have enough time to qualify it. I wrote an unqualified audit report. Now, what is really funny is between the time of writing the paper and getting the results, I thought to myself, there's no way that I will ever pass and ever become a chartered accountant, because I can think how people in a dark room at SAICA sits and discuss this Keith Jordaan, which is such a high risk for the profession because he writes unqualified audit reports for a evidently qualified audit report where it was needed. The point that I'm carrying over is this was a question that bowled me. It was above what I expected, but I went back and I got those basic marks. Let's get back to the structure and the professional presentation thereof. You don't need the same structure as the solution. That's very important, because what you are doing in your presentation, in your preparation, is you are working, you are revising, but you are also doing questions, doing lots of questions. We all give you this advice, do lots of questions. Now, whilst you are doing the question, you develop the skill of building a structure, of getting comfortable with tax questions. And when you go back to when you compare your solution to the suggested solution, you find that there are different structures. That is not a train smash. Your structure doesn't have to be the same. You must just have a structure that will ensure that you get the maximum amount of marks. If you have a structure, then you are in business. The structure need not be perfect, just a little bit better. That's the important part. How do we structure? What do we use to structure? Well, there are different things that we can use. And I think this is very valuable when we need to work on a structure for a professional presentation. You can structure by event. The event in the case study, for example, that could be a structure that you use. Or you could use a structure by definition. a definition of certain items in the case study, a definition of trading stock, a definition of donation, for example. Or you could use the criteria in the Act. For example, if we're dealing with a deduction item, we are dealing with expenditure and losses actually incurred during the year of assessment in the production of income, not of a capital nature. Those are the criteria items. We can use a section of the Act, the various sections of the Act, to create structure. We can use transactions or dates, or we can use the detailed information in the case study, or we could use a combination of these, all of these, to create a perfect solution, professional solution. Let me just talk about this. It takes time to develop the skill, building the structure. And please don't get impatient with yourself. We know that we always ask you to do the question and the exam conditions, but if you struggle with the technique or the ability, the skill of building structures, allow yourself a bit more time in the preparation time to get the structure right. Don't put pressure on yourself to quickly answer the question and then get demotivated. Just allow yourself 10 or 20% more time to plan adequately, to build a structure so that you can start to develop the skill. You've got to start from a zero base and work towards the ultimate knowledge skills base. It's not something that you can get in a single document or get it quickly. That is something that you need to develop. You've got to learn to trust yourself also. You know, some people are scared to write down something that might be wrong. Well, my example of the board exam is a typical example of that you must trust yourself. I trusted myself that I can at least earn marks by writing the introduction and the closure of the audit report, etc. Learning to trust yourself is also that scenario that you find that when you look at the solution, you say, yes, but I knew that, but I didn't write it down. Well, that means that you missed something in the structure. So go back and ask yourself, why did you not write that down? Develop that skill by doing questions. Very important. At varsity, and this is where things tended to go wrong, and this is why we need to work on the skill. At varsity, we never learned the skill. Nobody taught us the skill of developing the ability to answer in a professional manner. Usually the taxation lecturers would come into the lecture hall and present section 1 transfer pricing and then get out of there because the students now understand transfer pricing. No, that's actually a pity. What I did is I always started with the zooming out. Where are we? Zoom in. Where are we now? Why do we have the section? And the why in the why question was so critical for me. If I could carry that over to the students, the why, I could actually see how they started to understand the principles of tax. Learn the detail first. No, that's not right. Zoom out. Work at seeing the bigger picture first. Then break it down into smaller pieces. And that is the whole point. Start with the logic, the structure, and the overall picture first. Then only the section of the Act. Teach your brain to do this by doing questions. Very important. Identify the core issue. Let me just give you an example of that, because remember we said you're going to identify the core issue as a starting point and then build your spider web around that. So let's look at a typical example, a deduction. For section 11 to be applicable, we've got expenditure and losses actually incurred, year of assessment, in the production of income, not of a capital nature. Incidentally, when I wrote this down in the production of income, you must remember income is defined. So there's a definition there that you can use in your structure as well, in your presentation, to accumulate the maximum amount of marks. When you're working with section 11A, we need to look at the fact that there's a definition of income if the marks indicates that you need to do that. But all will not be equal in the case study. This is the criteria, but not all of the criteria will be equal in the case study. For example, the expenditure and losses, that is simple. It's there. The client did incur the expense. Was it actually incurred? That could be a bit fuzzy. Let's assume he made a provision for a certain bonus, and the bonus is only payable after year of assessment. Then we've got a problem of actually incurred. And of course, actually incurred, section 11 moves to section 23. Provisions are not allowed as a deduction. And then year of assessment. In what year of assessment is this item deductible? The year of assessment. So all will not be equal in the case study. You may find different questions, and the different questions on section 11A will have different solutions. Or you may find two questions that are very similar, but the one has got a problem with expenditure and losses. The one has a problem with number 1, and the other has a problem with number 4 in the production of income, the PE electric tramway situation. This is where it becomes tricky, because in the production of income is not defined. Only income is defined. In the production of income, now we need to work towards case law. We will explain, first of all, why we're going to case law. We will mention the name of the case. We will mention the outcomes of the case, and we will conclude on that. Very important. Make a small conclusion. Why do you think is this case law relevant, or why is it not relevant? Thus, look at the bigger picture first and then zoom into the smaller items after that. Focus on the ability to structure as opposed to knowing the answer. I've talked about this earlier. Straight into the specific section is not the right thing to do. Sit back and look at the bigger picture. Is each section in the Act in isolation? No. Again, see the bigger picture. Example, transfer pricing. Transfer pricing is really an income issue for a company. So therefore, we've got to look at the bigger picture of gross income. If, of course, the marks, the case study allows for that. The solution sits in the navigation of the books. You've got to better understand the natural flow of information. So look at the index, make sure that you can use that during the exam to an optimum level. What marks are allocated for? What are marks allocated for? Question mark. Write the full section? No, not necessarily. We must apply the section. The application is very important. We're going to use the word thus or the name of the taxpayer. The application of the information is critical. The information in isolation means nothing. So please remember that is very critical. Then what is a discussion question and the mark allocation? And this is something that Francois mentioned to me, and I thought it's very valuable for me to share it with you. There was a question in one of the tasks that talked about an installment credit agreement. Installment credit agreement. If it was for 5 marks, you would then work with the application of the core issue. Yes, it is a installment credit agreement, and therefore the tax treatment of an installment credit agreement is as follows, and the VAT implication of an installment credit agreement is as follows. But when it's for 15 marks, we will know by looking at the index of the Act and the index of the section that there's a definition for an installment credit agreement, and we will write down the definition of an installment credit agreement, but make it applicable to the information in the case study. If you don't make it applicable, it's simply a dumping of knowledge, which is not what we are looking for. As a last point during my presentation this morning, I just want to refer you to a recording that Yvonne recently made on how to approach a discussion question. I also had a look at that. We worked on the detail of how to develop this video together, and we came up with a brilliant structure. So I would like to refer you to that. We will send you the link to that presentation, how to approach a discussion question. And this is really all about the answer versus the process. You know, getting to the answer is not the issue. The process, the skill, the development of the professional skill, that is what is crucial. Right, so Yvonne, I hope you are ready on your side. That's more or less what I've got from my side. Thank you so much, everybody, and enjoy the rest of the session. Yvonne, over to you.
Thanks, Keith. I really appreciate your time this morning, and I think, oh man, I don't think we can emphasize enough the value of the stuff that you're discussing, because if we take a look, for example, in the April ITC, I think it was like 88 to 90% of the marks in the exam was discussion based, right? So, you know, you're like, that's where the marks are sitting, your ability to structure discussion and get the marks for whatever it is, you know. So I don't we cannot emphasize how important this stuff is. So thank you very, very much for your stuff. On behalf of the students, I think it's awesome.
Totally agree. Thank you, Yvonne.
Thank you.
Enjoy the rest.
Thanks. Have an awesome day. Have an awesome afternoon.
You too.